Thank you for joining us on Sozo Firm Insights with our host, Andrew Jensen.
How the Trump administration is shaping global perception of the United States. A new era of distrust and division. The United States has long been seen as a global leader, an economic and military powerhouse, an advocate for democracy, and a pillar of international support in times of crisis. For decades, countries across the world turned to the U.S. in moments of need, whether during natural disasters, humanitarian crises, or in the defense of freedom and human rights. However, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, this image has begun to shift dramatically. The Trump administration's policies and actions, both domestic and international, have raised significant questions about the United States' role in the world, its priorities, and its ability to foster international trust. While some Americans may view Trump's America First agenda as a step toward reclaiming national strength, it has left a growing sense of uncertainty abroad. In fact, the U.S. is now being seen in a different light, one that is less about partnership and global cooperation, and more about unilateral strength, self-interest, and at times, bullying tactics. The United States, from benevolent global power to isolationist bully. Historically, the United States has stood as a reliable force for good on the world stage, whether assisting in humanitarian efforts, providing disaster relief, or defending the weaker nations from aggressors. The U.S. was seen as a beacon of hope, compassion, and strength. This legacy stems from its role in World War I and World War II, where the U.S. not only helped defeat tyranny, but also rebuilt war-torn countries. Since then, the U.S. maintained its position as a global leader, largely due to its unmatched military power, economic influence, and, perhaps most importantly, its reputation for standing with those in need. However, under Trump, this reputation has been significantly challenged. The America First doctrine promoted by the Trump administration advocates for prioritizing U.S. interests, often at the expense of global cooperation and empathy. Trump's America First slogan, often a rallying cry for his supporters, encapsulates a worldview where the U.S. focuses primarily on its own gains, with little regard for the impact on others. This has been reflected in a variety of policies, from withdrawing from international environmental accords and the Iran nuclear deal, to undermining long-standing alliances such as NATO and retreating from global trade agreements. On the global stage, Trump's actions have made it clear that the U.S. is no longer seen as a partner in a world community. Instead, the United States is often viewed as a nation willing to act unilaterally, imposing its will on others without regard for their needs or desires. In the eyes of many nations, this has shifted the U.S. from a champion of the underdog to a nation that will only lend its support if it stands to gain in the process. A world shaped by military might, not empathy. The Trump administration's focus on military expansion is another significant shift in U.S. foreign policy. The administration has consistently pushed for a stronger military presence, both in terms of funding and global reach. While military strength has always been a cornerstone of U.S. influence, the Trump administration's emphasis on using this muscle as a tool for leverage, rather than diplomacy, has raised concerns about the United States' intentions on the global stage. Many critics argue that this militaristic approach to foreign policy reduces the U.S. to a bully on the world stage, one that flexes its military might to get what it wants. The withdrawal from international agreements, the heavy-handed sanctions on nations like Iran and Venezuela, and the threats to intervene in conflicts, these are all signs of a U.S. that is increasingly relying on force rather than collaboration. This shift has repercussions for how other countries perceive the U.S. At one time, American intervention was seen as a stabilizing force in global conflict, often working in conjunction with international organizations like the United Nations. Now, countries are beginning to question whether the U.S. will continue to act as a defender of the weak, or if it will prioritize its own interests above all else. The U.S. is no longer the first country that nations turn to for aid or support. Rather, it has become one that others must be wary of. The changing role of the United States in humanitarian crises. One of the most jarring aspects of the Trump administration's policies has been its retreat from humanitarian efforts abroad. Historically, the U.S. has been a leader in providing aid to countries facing crises such as famine, disease outbreaks, and natural disasters. The U.S. government has played an instrumental role in funding global health initiatives, supporting refugees, and providing emergency relief. However, under Trump, there has been a noticeable shift away from these initiatives. The Trump administration's policies, such as slashing funding for international aid programs and limiting the number of refugees allowed into the U.S., have caused many to wonder whether the U.S. will continue to be a reliable partner in addressing global crises. Nations that once relied on the U.S. for support are now questioning whether they can count on the U.S. to come to their aid in times of trouble, or whether the country has turned inward, focused solely on its own wealth and prosperity. In the case of the coronavirus pandemic, for example, the U.S. was initially slow to respond to global health needs, while countries like China and Russia stepped in with their own forms of aid. The U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization further alienated the country from international cooperation in solving global health challenges. The long-term impact, irreversible damage to U.S. reputation. The question remains, will the damage done to the U.S.'s reputation be reversible? The Trump administration's disregard for long-standing alliances and its emphasis on national self-interest have left a mark on how other countries perceive the United States. In many parts of the world, the U.S. is no longer viewed as a trusted ally or a champion of global peace and justice. Instead, it is seen as a nation that will prioritize its own interests, even if it means leaving others to fend for themselves. The long-term impact of this shift remains to be seen. Will the next administration be able to repair the damage done by Trump's policies? It is unclear whether the U.S. can ever fully reclaim its role as a global leader in the way it once was. Countries that were once eager to align themselves with the U.S. are now more cautious, less willing to take American promises at face value. What should other countries do? In this new geopolitical landscape, nations must reconsider their approach to dealing with the United States. In the past, countries could count on the U.S. to be a steady and reliable partner. Now, countries must be more strategic and cautious in their dealings with the U.S. They should not take American promises for granted or trust that the U.S. will come to their aid when the need arises. This does not mean that the U.S. should be written off entirely, nor should its citizens be held accountable for the actions of their government. However, the world must acknowledge that the United States under the Trump administration has become a different kind of global power, one that is self-interested, less empathetic, and more willing to use force than diplomacy. The current administration's approach may be temporary, but the consequences for the U.S.'s reputation on the global stage may be lasting. It remains to be seen how future U.S. administrations will rebuild trust, but one thing is clear. The world has changed, and so too has the way other countries perceive the United States. The country's position as a global leader, willing to fight for the underdog, is no longer as certain as it once was. For now, caution is the watchword, and trust must be earned again, if it can be at all.
You've been listening to Sozo Firm Insights. For over 20 years, we've been providing strategic growth and leadership insights for businesses, nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and higher education institutions. Thank you for joining us.